Hi, everyone. So delighted to be here on behalf of myself, Leah West, and all of the panelists. We are here to join you for 20 minutes of a panel discussion and then 15 minutes answering your questions. So the very first question I want to get kick-started right away is that the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly impacted how most of us are living, working, and connecting. So I want to ask our experts, I'm going to start with you, Rajiv, and then move to Bruce. What trends have you seen evolve in the cybersecurity landscape since the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so kicking it off, I'll focus on threats, as that's from the Cyber Center, but really just a couple of trends that we saw. Certainly when the pandemic started was obviously people shifted out of their offices and back to their homes and connected remotely, either to the cloud or to their legacy office environments. And obviously threat actors picked up on this and they adjusted their tactics as well. They tended to focus on the secure remote access sites and weaker or less robust authentication mechanisms. So we saw a lot of password stuffing, reuse of stolen credentials, these sorts of things in terms of authentication. And in terms of the VPN devices themselves, there was a number of publicly known vulnerabilities that threat actors really seized upon and were certainly attempting to exploit on an ongoing basis that kept us very busy as well. So that was kind of the remote access side. And another trend I wanted to point out that's fairly common and people would have noticed is certainly the phishing that was happening, or the smishing, or the SMS phishing. And really, in terms of volumes, we didn't see an increase when the pandemic started, but really what we saw was an immediate shift in themes, and that was really the transfer over to the basically the COVID-related themes and these sorts of things, right? So we saw a shift from maybe taxation, which is what you normally see in March or April, over to the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, or vaccine research and these sorts of things. So we worked very closely to try to prevent these. Obviously, it mattered to us because we didn't want Canadians to be infected by malware, but also we wanted a very clear message from our public health agencies to not be distorted by any malicious websites that were purporting to be the government of Canada. So worked with our partners to identify these and take them down to try to make sure that this was not a threat to Canadians or our messaging from the government.
All right, five things I want to mention. Insecure home computers. We are increasingly not using secure, maintained corporate computers, but home computers. Data moved outside corporate networks into Dropbox, into home computers, into less secure places. Insecure network access, we just heard about that. People using lots of unfamiliar tools, Zoom one of them, this Polycom thing that I didn't unmute, another one. And largely we're doing things differently. And there is business email compromise that's based on convincing an employee to do things differently. Well, we're doing everything differently. And that was a vector for attack. Those are the five very general reasons things were different, security got worse.
Great. Can we move on to Jacques? Then I'll hear from Andrew and Bonnie, please.
Thanks, Leah. I think one of the biggest trends we saw was people wanting to collaborate remotely. So from an enterprise point of view, things change. There's been a broader adoption of cloud technology, and it caused for enterprise the security perimeter to change. So back before, the security perimeter was pretty stable. People, the staff, the users, and the assets were inside the enterprise network. And we did have some cloud services, but we had controls over those. Now the target, the security perimeter is a moving target. So the users are actually outside of the enterprise network. And there's shadow IT apps happening more and more. They find the shiny new tool to collaborate with, and it does enable collaboration, but it does expose internal information. So the challenge is many enterprises, we need to adapt to those changing collaboration environment within enterprises.
Great, thanks. Andrew, and then Bonnie, please.
Thanks. I'll echo exactly what the other panelists have just noted. I think what I would add to it is the trend that we're noticing is that history is repeating itself, and that cyber threats, whether they're nation state or financially motivated cyber criminals, are an omnipresent threat. They're like water pushing up against the dam. What's changed in the last year has been our working patterns, but not the effort on the part of the cyber threat actors, the criminals, what have you. And we're seeing an increased focus on VPNs, edge devices, changes in phishing techniques, but overall the threat's remaining the same, and the difficulty in defending against it, as I mentioned, is repeating itself. So we're seeing a lot of the same themes, just a different flavor this year.
And one of the things I'm noticing, and I think will become a discussion, we're maybe at the beginning of this trend that I think we're going to be discussing soon, is that the security community as a whole was caught off guard. Not just the cybersecurity community, but the larger security community with physical security, IT security, risk management. The pandemic was dealt with by governments and public health experts, but there wasn't the time or the preparation to have the rest of the security disciplines and domains involved and to input. And I think over time we'll see that there were silos, that there wasn't a comprehensive strategy to deal with an overall societal shutdown, a bureaucracy shutdown, which there really aren't plans for. And as the time dragged on, I think we're going to see that a more comprehensive design and new security models may be required.
Thank you so much for all of that insight. So given the trends that we've just identified, too much to really summarize, I guess what advice would you all offer? And what are some of the best practices you believe institutions, so thinking at the institutional level, should be incorporating to enhance their cybersecurity? And I'll start now with Andrew and then move to Jacques.
Sure. In a word, I would say invest. And what that means is to take cybersecurity seriously, treat it as part of the business in the same way that legal, marketing, sales, business development are all part of your day in and day out efforts. And so invest means taking the time to look at cybersecurity, making organizational changes to treat it as a priority. Yes, it does mean financial investment as well, but it doesn't have to be a disproportionate amount. The thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, whether you're in a small business or in an enterprise environment, is that to make meaningful change in cybersecurity and to increase your defensive posture, implementing some simple best practices, baseline controls is a document published by the Canadian Cyber Center for Security and Center for Cybersecurity, pardon me. And just by doing some simple things, including limited patch management, can make you a much stronger network and avoid cybersecurity issues.
Great, thank you. Jacques, and then I'll follow up with Bonnie.
Yeah, so I'll echo what Andrew just said, right? You need to implement the best practice. But I think what we're doing as an industry today is we're redefining what the new best practice is for your information security management practice. So people are working at home, the security perimeter is not clear where it is. There's information all over the map. So once you define a security policy, you define what controls you need to put around the information. You need to develop new best practice to protect your information, either inside your enterprise network or on the internet through the cloud services. And there's new technology like CASB, which is cloud-based security broker. They control your information in somebody else's cloud. So that's something people need to learn. And then you need to keep, every time you sprawl on the internet with a new cloud service, you got to make sure they work within your infrastructure, that you do SSO login, you have MFA, multi-factor authentication, and stuff like the field effect. You need to put in next-gen endpoint protection. It goes a little bit deeper than the normal stuff does. And the last thing I wanted to say, the good old cyber awareness training your staff on basic security stuff, like don't click on suspicious link. This is more relevant today than it was before. And we've spent a lot of time and effort developing DNS services, clean DNS services. So, these on firewall for your enterprise network, at least put that in to protect your basic infrastructure. So we need to adapt fast as an enterprise.
Bonnie, then we'll go to Rajiv and then finish up with Bruce on this question.
Thanks, Leah. I think organizations probably have learned in many cases from this whole pandemic experience that they're going to need crisis management plans, even small organizations, because the shutdowns were much more dramatic, much more unpredictable, and much longer than a business continuity plan can generally handle. And beyond crisis management, we're going to have to look at very seriously security convergence, which is looking at physical and IT security together, particularly with work from home and flexible work plans and rolling lockdowns perhaps, and also organizational resilience, that it's going to take into account the multiple security disciplines and domains beyond cybersecurity that are all going to come into play at various levels within the organization. And if without that, whether it's another pandemic or another type of scenario that would lock us down, organizations, institutions, companies are going to struggle greatly if they can't have something more durable over time.
Thanks, Rajiv.
Yes, a lot of really good things said already. I mean, yeah, I'd echo a lot of the comments. Certainly one thing we saw, multi-factor authentication for anything sensitive, if people can do it, is a good tip. Lots of good guidance on the Cyber Center website, as well as small, medium enterprise controls. The first rule is, make a plan, so I echo that as well. Bruce had mentioned, endpoint security for unmanaged endpoints. Well, part of that is just patching as well, right? Those unmanaged endpoints aren't patched, don't have the latest AVs on them and that sort of thing. So how do you make sure that those are secure? And if they're not, make sure that valuable information isn't heading out there as well. So that's keeping track of your information and knowing where it is and protecting it accordingly, whether that's backing it up and encrypting it, right, for those ransomware cases and other sorts of items like that. So just general best practices. And of course, we're here at the CIRA site, so I shout out for the CIRA Canadian Shield, super important. And for us, it was very important to support that as well during the pandemic. DNS is a powerful tool to reduce the risks of phishing and other sorts of threats.
And Bruce, what would you have to add?
I think everyone said it. Everyone said it. I mean, the answer is do all of the things, and that's what we should do.
Great. Do all of the things. I'm writing that down. Okay. So the next
in the correct order, of course.
Of course. Yes. Thank you. And I'm going to start with you, Bruce, on this question. So I think I know what your answer is going to be. But what future trend or emerging technology do you believe is going to have significant impact on cybersecurity? And if you want to touch on something you didn't touch on earlier today, or just double down on IoT,
wow, what do you think my answer is going to be?
You.
What do you think my answer is going to be?
I'm going to guess IoT.
No, and actually, I think the thing that's going to change your industry the most is going to be AI, and it's going to change it in ways we actually don't understand. And AI is very nonlinear. Things that we thought were easy end up being hard. Things that thought were hard would end up being easy. I was taught that the game of Go would never be solved by an AI because it's computationally infeasible. And like Google did it on their lunch break one time because they just had the computing power. So I think AI and vulnerability finding, that really seems like the sort of thing that's amenable to an automatic process. So you can imagine 20 years from now, software vulnerabilities are a thing of the past. They don't exist anymore, which is how will be great for defense, but of course great for the offense for all the legacy stuff. AI used as in attack, in defense, attacking and defending at machine speeds. It's unclear who will have the advantage. We saw DARPA in the United States do that grand challenge, which had AIs battling each other in a capture the flag contest. I think that's going to be the most disruptive technology in the next decade in our industry. And it's really unclear how it disrupts in an industry, which way it disrupts.
Thanks, Bruce. And thank you for blowing my mind on your answer. Bonnie, can I hear from you next? And then we'll go to Jacques.
Sure. I think one of the very serious new trends that we're going to have to deal with, it involves China and Russia. For example, they've been taking a much more strategic approach to security and traditional security measures and cybersecurity than is typical in the West. For example, business continuity is often operational in level in how it's treated. But China has, with their, for example, the Huawei subsidiary HiSilicon developed the Kirin chip, And that was a strategic level security measure that allowed Huawei to keep going after it was blocked out of markets in some areas. So that kind of use, or Russia, for example, with their very sophisticated strategic planning, which has been in the works for 20 years. Cybersecurity economics, what the pandemic has done to people's patterns of behavior and how cybersecurity is treated during a pandemic scenario is really shifting what I think is going to be coming out of cybersecurity economics. And so I think over time, we're going to really need to be looking at raising the level of sophistication and strategic study of security disciplines and domains, both in cybersecurity and more generally, to be able to handle this kind of serious risk and threat environment, because our competitors already are.
Thanks, Bonnie. Jacques, and then Rajiv, and we'll conclude with Andrew.
Yes, so I'm going to switch my CIRA Labs so our innovation engine at CIRA. So one future trend that we're looking at is the 5G IoT devices. So in the near future, we're going to have 1 trillion IoT devices that are going to be 5G enabled, according to a bunch of research. And what that means is we're going to have IoT device with SIM cards. And it's a IoT device that would connect to the like the Panelists network. And the attribute of those IoT devices, they have eSIMs. They're either a SIM on a chip or a SIM card integrated in a chip. And that means the IoT device doesn't have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. There's no way to program it. And the new thing that's coming up is remote eSIM provisioning. So the industry right now is trying to figure out how are we going to provision credentials inside IoT device remotely, zero touch, securely. So what's the framework around doing all of this? You want your garage door opener to report back to the security service that you purchase and not somewhere else compromised by a bad actor. So what we're doing right now is we looked at this, we got involved over the last year with eSIM, remote eSIM provisioning. We're developing a IoT registry, which is a framework very similar to domain names. People trust CIRA to run a domain on your behalf to set it up. I think remote eSIM provisioning with the IoT registry is the future for 5G. And we've been working on this for the last year. We're doing a real life pilot. And somehow I think we need to bring this opportunity to protect the future. Otherwise, if we don't have a structured way of protecting those trillion of the IoT device in the future, we're going to have a big problem. So now's the time to fix this before it's too late.
Thanks. If I can just get about a minute answer from Rajiv and then Andrew.
Okay, so quickly, I'll stray from technology and go to more business, and I'll say one of the trends is maybe resonance with what Andrew said, but it's really seeing cybersecurity as an enabler, right? When you get into the 5G and the fourth industrial revolution and AI engines and connectivity and IoT, I mean, really the ramifications and risks involved in our new society are massive. And really seeing cybersecurity as a strategic enabler for businesses, whatever they're building, they need to build that in from the start. It's got to be top consideration. The risks have to be assessed from the start, and they need to, really refine the processes, because this is getting into a different world. It's not just your computer going down. It's this is critical infrastructure and physical reality. So it's really seeing that strategic enabler at the highest level of the board.
And we'll conclude with Andrew, please.
Thanks. Cybersecurity can mean a lot of things. It's a very broadly defined term. I'll interpret it to mean the ability to defend a network. And I think the trend that we're going to see, and we already see, is the continuing dominance of technology in our lives and the interlinkage between all of it. And what Bruce said regarding the AI piece and the DARPA challenge, like if anybody hasn't taken a look at that, it's quite mystifying, and it's an amazing process that they put on. But If you take a look at AI, 5G, IoT, what have you, I think it's easy to feel perhaps that this is an impossible problem, and that we'll continue down the road of perhaps not doing enough about it. And the thing that concerns me the most is that the attackers, the actors, cybersecurity and cyber threats is not a new game. It's been around for decades. And the people that are perpetrating the attacks are, I would say, at least a decade in strategy ahead of where most of us are in terms of defending. And one of the things that I think we could draw some parallels from or learn from are the medical fields or aviation safety from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. These are fields that learn from their mistake. They implement process. They have standards. They have ways to designate who are expert at what. And I think if the pandemic today is as bad as it is, was a cybersecurity problem, we'd probably have a small group of people with the solution. They'd be completely ignored. There'd be a group of people, pumping a new set of sneakers to outrun the virus, and then we'd have a host of all sorts of other ridiculous kinds of solutions. And at the end of the day, cybersecurity is not an impossible problem. It's a very complex one. But there is some science behind it, and just in the same way that aviation safety improved because planes were falling out of the sky, in just the same way that medical practices and health medicine, as complex as it is, we were able to elevate and move beyond it, and we're still continuing to do that. I think this trend is something that, in terms of technology, is something that we can grapple with. We just need to have the right focus on it.
Great. Thank you so much. And so we're going to move now to question and answers. I hope everyone will stay with us. We are running about 20 minutes behind simply because the AGM discussions went a bit longer, so please bear with us. I'm going to start with questions right away from Rosemary, who's asking, what are your views on whether or not Canada should adopt 5G, and who are the most secure partners to work with? I'm not going to ask Rajiv for his opinion on this to start, but I'm going to start actually with Andrew. What do you think in terms of whether or not Canada should adopt 5G, and then maybe we'll hear from Bruce next.
I think that's maybe a bit of a false question. The migration is inevitable. Should we adopt it? Yes. If we don't, there's a whole host of other economic issues at play. I think that what we do need to have is a discussion and understanding of what the actual technological differences are. It's not just the traditional nation state and some of the security threats around or risks around China and supply chain that are an issue. It is literally depositing technology all over the place geographically. And if we know anything from our experience with cybersecurity to date, is that we're not great at securing lots of independent devices. So I think we need to understand the technology as a community and make sure that we can address it appropriately.
Now, I actually don't have a lot to add. It's a big debate in the United States. I'm not following companies. I mean, yes, you're going to have it. It's unclear if 5G is real or a marketing term. A lot of articles about that. And just when as a country, when you think about it, don't confuse the security issues with the trade issues. The Trump administration is doing that, and it's a freaking disaster. So understand what the trade issues are, understand what the security issues are, and don't conflate them.
Bonnie.
Right. I think that's exactly part of the complexity, is that, as the Australian government recently mentioned, we do need some clarity on how different states are interpreting the cyber law void. We don't have an international cyber law, and so many Western states are relying upon international humanitarian law or human rights law, whereas China is often displacing to international investment law, as with the trade deal with Canada, which gives them national treatment standard, which puts Chinese companies on par with Canadian companies, and they must be treated equally. So how countries are interpreting international law in the absence of cyber law is actually driving part of the conflict between countries in how they're interpreting it. I think Australia was absolutely correct in trying to get some clarity on that.
Bonnie, I could talk international cyber law all day long, but nobody wants to hear from me. So Gerhard Mack is asking.
Which is sad.
I'm not here. They're here to listen to you guys. So I noticed. This is Gerhard Mack is asking. I noticed that the German government has started to proactively scan IP ranges in their country regularly for remote vulnerabilities. Is there any advantage to this approach? And he's asking about whether Canada should look to do the same. So I guess in terms of scanning IP vulnerabilities, I'll see if Rajiv has anything that he wants to add first, and see if anybody else wants to jump in.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's valuable, right? As long as people get the right information out of that scanning information. I mean, it's publicly available. It's out there on the internet. At the same point in time, there are services that do that. Shodan does that, right, and catalogs this, and it's really useful information in terms of vulnerabilities, especially for critical infrastructure. So there are sources like that, and yes, it is a useful thing. And certainly there have been innovation type workshops that have done these sorts of things on a national basis as well to produce useful results.
Andrew.
I think Rajiv nailed it, is that the attackers already have an index database called Shodan that already provides this information. It is precisely the way attackers operate. They go at scale, they use tools, and then they know the vulnerabilities they can exploit, they find them on Shodan, and then away they go. I'm not sure the specifics around what the German government is doing, but the underlying concept or what it is they're bringing to the table, I think, would be visibility, and that's a huge part of what's missing in cybersecurity today, which is being aware of who your users are, where your assets are, what their configuration is, because even though you may not know what the configuration is or where they are, an attacker sure the heck will.
Great. So I'm going to paraphrase a question from James Dixon, who's basically asking about the trend that we're seeing in certain countries to close off their networks from the broader internet in order to control, depending on who you're asking, either control state security over their cybersecurity networks, or to control access to information by their citizens, and to be able to leverage the networks for own national security interests, however you want to define it. And I guess the broader question that James is really getting at is whether or not this is a trend we should expect to see move into more Western states, whether it's something we should anticipate just happening naturally, or do you see there being resistance to that move to kind of nationalize nets and really keep it an open internet. So I guess I'll start with Rajiv, if you have any thoughts on that, and then we'll go around the panel.
I'll maybe go from the resiliency angle, right? I mean, there are countries that are, seems to be, practicing these exercises as well in terms of disconnecting themselves from the internet. And that might speak to, what are our sovereign capabilities within our own country at that point in time, and why might countries be doing this? So I think it's important to understand, the internet is a shared environment, and one environment can make changes and invoke changes on our, our lives nowadays when everything is so interconnected. So, what are the protections we need to put in place to be at least resilient to these changes when it seems like other countries are actually, practicing this sort of thing at times?
Jacques.
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about the confidentiality part of this. From a resiliency part of it, I think it'd be worthwhile for Canada to do an exercise in shutting down the borders on paper and assess what it's like. Because over the last 10 years or 7 years, CIRA's been working hard in trying to promote Internet Exchange Point across Canada. That's where networks interconnect together. But a lot of this is not happening in Canada. So bringing visibility on how resilient is our infrastructure in Canada on its own would be a benefit of this, but we certainly believe in an open internet. We shouldn't be talking about putting borders.
Go to Bruce.
So it's interesting. So, I mean, you can imagine reasons why China wants to do this are very different reasons why Canada might want to do this. And we are seeing more talk about what I think of as internet balkanization. And look at the geopolitics, seem to be moving into three spheres. Kind of a US-centric sphere, which I think Canada would be part of, an EU-centric sphere. I mean, I talked about in my talk about EU saying to Facebook, don't bring data to the US. And then a China-centric sphere. And China and the countries they're exploring technology to, including, very detailed surveillance technologies. So you can imagine the internet splitting into three, with some other splinters. Russia kind of wants to do it alone. Other countries might. And this is hard. I mean, only the US and China really have the US actually can. It's really only China can have a Chinese-only internet, hardware, software, everything. Every other country, we are deeply, deeply international. So there's a lot of talk here for reasons that are both just and unjust. And yeah, this is a trend worth watching. It worries me. I think we could easily see an internet split, hard splits in the next decade.
Bonnie.
Thanks. I recently produced a paper on exactly what Bruce is talking about, this three-way split between China, Russia, and the US. And it's basically a standoff of sorts where the US is losing international status as the other powers gain strength. And China is projecting economically and with 5G into other spheres of influence, and Russia is trying to defend their own sphere of influence and projecting out with cyber and even militarily with their support within Syria. And where this gets really interesting is those geostrategic projections, whether they are 5G, whether they are legal with domestic laws. For example, the Chinese intelligence law, which allows Chinese nationals to collect intelligence in other states with the international applicability of the law and requirements. And there was recently we will see it coming to the West. There was a recommendation in the UK that companies should have to be compelled to comply with or cooperate with MI5. That recommendation, we'll see where it goes, but we are starting to see it come into the Western space. And with Russia, with their internet isolation law, they successfully tested it last year in 2019, where they were able to break off their internet for some time. And that may actually be a defensive strategy against blowback from geostrategic projections and responses to those from other countries. So I do think we will see more of it in the West. We're starting to see signs of it already. And I think the geostrategic projections and counter projections, another example would be globally systemically important banks. Russia does not have a globally systemically important bank, and so would probably have some measure of buffer from any kind of financial blowback or disruptions within the financial sector.
Great. So I'm going to move on to our next question. So the question is from Leonard, and he's looking to know whether or not there should be any health-based security issues. Because the proposition is that Canadian servers are considered more secure, or will crash national servers to be considered safe for long term. I'm guessing that the question is really just looking at whether or not we can secure our health infrastructure, given how, as Bruce pointed out, our internet is really deeply interconnected. Does anyone want to jump in to start? I guess, Rajiv, thinking from just a, critical infrastructure protection point of view, health infrastructure being one that's top of mind these days, how is Canada doing in the sense of protecting its critical infrastructure and in terms of and specifically its health infrastructure?
Yeah, and in terms of health, I mean, that was something that certainly rose to the top during the pandemic, right? So in terms of the Cyber Center, that's one where we were, we definitely had to reach out and work together with that sector to understand the state of affairs in the health sector, where we could help, where we couldn't help, what norms exist and what standards exist. And, Canada doesn't have, national legislation yet in terms of, regulation of cybersecurity for all of its sectors in specific ways, but, there was promised in the budget, and we'll see what happens in the near term. but it's certainly something that has to be looked at. We certainly saw impacts on the UK health sector during the Petya or the ransomware attacks, right? That actually did disable parts of them. We fared fairly well in Canada because the system seemed to be fairly well patched. So we did suffer that one fairly well, but at the same point in time, there is some work to be done in all critical sectors, to be quite honest, in terms of regulation and getting to common baselines for what needs to be done in each area.
Andrew.
I think questions like this are important and they're natural, but I think sometimes it's easy to treat something as special and unique when really it's all around data security and data privacy, and there really is no national border when it comes to best practices and good ways to do things. And I know certainly when I've seen a doctor, I'll naturally ask about what they do for cybersecurity, and they'll say, well, our email is secure and whatever, and they're just making statements, and it's born of this practice where even in today you see legal documents when you're signing an agreement and they talk about secure transmission, and such as email or fax, and it's like these are like decades old practices. In our incident response practice, we've helped health clinics recover from ransomware and all sorts of other issues. Their network security was obviously substandard or had some vulnerabilities in it. That's how they got ransomware or attacked. But I can say happily that those clinics and those medical practices that were using medical record systems that did things like encrypt the records on disk and automatically lock access to those records when a user wasn't actively using them, saved disclosure of a lot of protected health information. And so there's an example of using effective technology in the right way that, despite a bunch of other things having gone wrong, including organizational process, investment, all those other things, the sensitive data was protected.
Does anyone else want to jump in as I unmute myself? No? Okay, we have 1 minute left, so we have time for one very quick question. Let me just find it here.
It's gotta be a yes or no question.
It has to be a yes or no question. So this is the yes or no question. With everyone working from home, with the interconnected, with all the trends we saw from COVID, are we less cyber secure? Yes or no? I'll start with Bruce, then Jacques, then Andrew, then Bonnie, then Rajiv.
Less secure.
More
secure. Okay, Andrew.
Less secure, more aware.
Bonnie?
I don't think we know yet, because I think we were caught off guard. And I think the different disciplines have to figure out what the implications are of having been effectively shut down by public health.
Not a yes or no answer, Bonnie. Rajiv.
I'd say less, but evolving towards more perhaps in the future.
Great. So that is time. Thank you so much to all the panelists, and thank you to everyone who participated by sending in questions, and hopefully we answered your questions, and I'll now turn it back over to the main event. Thank you so much.